Welcome to Shifting Ground, the podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Join us every other week as our editors connect the pages of Orbis with the issues of the day.
I'm Nick Gvosdev, a professor at the Naval War College and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
And I'm Larry Rubin, an associate professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology.
Together, we serve as editors of Orbis, the Journal of World Affairs.
Each episode will speak with scholars, policymakers, and practitioners about the forces reshaping global politics, international security, and world affairs.
You can find this and future episodes of Shifting Ground on our website, orbisjournal.org, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major streaming services. Please note that the views expressed by the hosts and participants in this episode are their own. This is Shifting Ground.
Welcome to another edition of Shifting Ground, the Orbis podcast. I'm your co-host, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Larry Rubin, and today we're pleased to welcome the Honorable Tien. John's the Distinguished Professor of Practice at Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. He previously served as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security after a distinguished career spanning military service, business, nonprofit leadership, and public service under 4 U.S. presidents. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. And thanks to you, Larry, and to you, Nick, and really to FPRI and to the Nunn School. And I think it's super that you've started up this podcast and quite honestly, re-energizing Orbis in this particular way.
Well, I think we can end that podcast right there with all the flattery that we've just received, but we're about to flatter you a little bit more. And I think hear a little bit about your really remarkable career moving from military to business, nonprofit leadership, and of course, really some of the highest levels of government. And could you tell us a little bit about your life's journey and how those experiences basically brought you to where you are today?
Sure will. I mean, oftentimes you can get asked a question like this. You start with, I was born in blah, blah, blah. I won't say the year, but most people could figure it out. They just looked at all my gray hair. But I won't do that. I'll actually go backwards a little bit and start with my last job first, not obviously the things that you've spoken about, being a professor of the practice here at the Sam Nunn School, which also, by the way, I'm dual appointment in it's a little bit of a public service announcement. Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy at Georgia Tech, and also an external fellow at 2 organizations. We call them IRI, but they're essentially umbrella organizations. One is the Strategic Energy Institute, and the other is the Georgia Tech Research Institute. So say that partially because that's who funds me here at Georgia Tech, and partially because I really believe in these organizations, and I think they're doing right by the students and certainly right by Georgia, the Southeast, and the United States, and to some extent the world. All right, so going back to your good question. It's my last job was as the Department of Homeland Security Deputy Secretary. And while most folks have heard about the Department of Homeland Security, you got to unpack it a little bit to understand what the role of a Deputy Secretary would be for an organization like this. It's 250,000 people. It's the 3rd largest cabinet department out there with about 100 back when I was the Deputy Secretary, it was about $105 billion operating budget. It's significantly increased over the last 2 years in the Trump administration to, depending on how you do your math, $160 to $200 billion, especially with a lot of it focused on ICE and CBP. But for me, it was just, I'll put that in air quote, $105 billion operating budget. And the Deputy Secretary actually has 2 roles. One is you are the number 2 in the organization. The only person you report to is the Secretary. For me, it was Alejandro Mayorkas. And then the second job that you have is, and this is by statute, you're the Chief Operating Officer. And all of that entails for the 250,000 people and the $105 billion operating budget, plus all the different component agencies like CISA, FEMA, and others in the Coast Guard. How did I get to that? And if you were to look at my bio, you would see, prior to me being the Deputy Secretary, 0 DHS. I mean, literally. And folks are like, well, how did you get that? And I asked Secretary Mayorkas when he interviewed me back in the early spring of 2021. I said, so, just to make sure you've looked at my bio, you understand I don't have any DHS experience. He goes, look, we've only been around for 18 years. Most people at your level don't have a ton of DHS experience, but you have adjacent experience, and you have the kind of experience that really would fit well as a deputy secretary. And then he ran through he had my resume, CV. We didn't really know each other prior to this interview, but he's certainly done his prep. He'd already been Senate confirmed and in the job as the secretary for about 3 months at that point. And he said, number one, you were the National Security Council staff 2 different times for both, in a bipartisan way, for both George W. Bush and President Obama. You were also a White House fellow in the U.S. Trade Rep's office back in the late 1990s for President Clinton. So you have 3 really pretty meaty and very detailed engagement with what was called the interagency process. And I said, yep, true. All right, sir, if that's important, check. Then he said, you're coming out of the private sector where you've been for 10 years with Citigroup, which is Citigroup's one of the big 4 or 5 banks, depending how you count it. And he says, that's financial services sector. That is one of the 16 U.S. critical infrastructure sectors. And I said, got it. You're right about that for sure. And it's a pretty important one because wealth, capitalism, the macro micro economy drives the world. So he says, you already have, that's one of the things that we do here at DHS is protect our critical infrastructure. I said, all right, check on that. Then he said, you have something very interesting in which, is very much in common with many of the other deputies here in the Biden-Harris administration. And I said, what's that? He goes, you know each other. And, to some extent, I knew that because I was watching as people were coming on board. But even for me, there were some parallel appointments while I was going through. And, just to give you a bit of a taste, Biden-Harris looked a fair bit like Obama-Biden. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but it's certainly a good thing from relationships. And I know you both know how important relationships are in any organization, but especially one where you have to have a lot of trust in the process and trust in the people. The Deputy Attorney General was Lisa. These are just folks who I knew from my first time around with the Obama-Biden team. Lisa Monaco, who's the Deputy Attorney General. David Cohen was the CIA Deputy Director. The Department of Defense, or the Pentagon J3, was a guy named General Jim Mingus, a couple years ahead of me at West Point. The National Security Council Deputy, NSA, was John Feiner. And the Homeland Security Advisor was a former DPOP, as we call him here at the Nunn School, Liz Showard Randall, and we worked a lot together in the Obama-Biden time when she was doing, as I call it, shorthand NATO, and I was doing shorthand, call it ISAF in Afghanistan. And then he didn't say this, but my graduate school experience at both Oxford and the Harvard Kennedy School also connected me in different ways that were, again, who knew, but to any graduate students or anybody who's going through war college experiences, which essentially the Harvard Kennedy School was for me, relationships matter. And then the last thing he closed with, which I didn't expect, was he said, you were in the U.S. military. I said, okay, well, DHS is a civilian organization. It's civil servants. He goes, yeah, you were a civil servant too, by the way. FYI, and I go, that is true. I was a uniformed civil servant officer in the interagency process, as I just described, at the NSC and the EOP. But he said, look, DHS is the largest federal law enforcement agency, which is more than triple. It's about 120,000 people who are authorized to carry a sidearm effectively, so under arms, in uniform, in service of the United States of America. And it's more than triple what DOJ is. And most people would say, biggest federal law enforcement agency is the FBI, or the department is DOJ, and DHS is, again, triple between, federal air marshals, Secret Service, Coast Guard, who have a law enforcement component mission to themselves, ICE, CBP, and like I said, certain portions of TSA. So we said that combined with the fact that post 9/11, was so focused on counterterrorism, the culture of law enforcement from local to federal really became very militarized. Now that's something we could debate whether that's a good or a bad thing, but he said it definitely has infected the culture and impacted the culture, to use a less sort of, inflammatory word. And he said, that's going to go over really well with, again, about half of our folks and folks who have in organizations that are very, very heavily culture intensive. So I could walk my way all the way back to other things I did. But if you think about that, the military, the private sector, prior service in the NSC and the EOP, and really understanding the interagency process was, I think, a good way of describing why I ended up as the DHS deputy secretary, or at least as told by the guy who hired me.
In listening to that, what is fascinating to me is so often in the podcast, we talk about broad impersonal trends. We talk about the environment, we talk about the economy, technology. And yet, what listening to you describe all of this really brings back that at the end of the day, policy and strategy are made by individuals. They're made by concrete human beings, not by abstract concepts. And so I'd like to maybe tease out a bit more, in a way, using your own background and experience, the importance or role of the individual. And if I can start with, the reality that you have served under four presidents: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. And do you have a sense that the president, it matters who that individual is, that who sits in the Oval Office, it's not a generic abstract of the president, but a living, breathing human being with priorities, with biases, with inclinations, and then, as you said and stressed, networks, people around him, the people he trusts, the people he reaches out with. Is there a sense that you have now from this experience that what might you point out to students or to our listening audience in general about the importance of the individual, the actual person who sits at the center of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
It's a great question, Nick, and it's one that I'm often asked here at Georgia Tech or the Harvard Kennedy School, where I'm a senior fellow as well. And I'm asked, what was it like? Tell us some stories. People always want to hear Oval Office stories or White House Situation Room stories. And I've got plenty to tell. Maybe I'll tell a couple later on. I certainly tell them in classes because it keeps the students interested. But I think you hit on a really important point here, which is the president matters a lot, and the people he surrounds himself, and they've been all he's, as we know. Someday there may be a female president. But for now, it's been all he's. And for the people he surrounds himself with, those people have what I would call the president doesn't have an outsized authority. He doesn't. And I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or independent. And I'm not talking about this president or just the last president. They don't have an outside, in my opinion, they don't have an outsized authority. They may have a huge responsibility, but their authority is the one that we, through our democratic political process of the electoral college in particular in the vote, have given to them. That's their authority, and the responsibility is huge, and they take it upon themselves. But then the people that they bring in, especially you chose the White House for the address, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but the people they have over at the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, also sometimes known as the OEOB, and the NEOB, all those organizations, the NSC, those are largely appointees. There's a lot of civil servants for sure at the what I would call the GS-15 level and below. But above that, these are political appointees, and definitely inside the White House, as we know, the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, advisors, and we've seen it with all presidents. Doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican. That matters a lot. And so therefore, the president and how he views the world becomes particularly important. And if he views the world through a particular worldview, let's say a very much leader of the free world, or a America First, as the current president is viewing the world, that then informs all of their choices in terms of who they select. And the president still, at the end of the day, is a human being, as you noted. He still has to sleep for at least 6 hours, I think. Although I was really impressed by Bush and Obama and Biden, because Clinton I had a little less exposure to, but I was staffing literally Bush and Obama in real time, and President Biden, I was on, in National Security Council meetings with him at all hours of the night, especially in the early days of the Afghanistan withdrawal. So for these presidents, they are pretty tireless and, highly dedicated to what they do. I think each one of them would say that none of them sort of ascribe to the great man theory, that they are a Winston Churchill, that they were born for this. I think all of them would say that their way and their journey to the Oval Office and the leader of the free world, and certainly the United States of America, was a combination of their life journeys combined with their skill sets. And I think probably the most important thing, a desire to serve their fellow citizens and a dedication to the free world. Really, I think all three presidents would say that. I think the other thing, that the attribute that they bring to the plate, is they really do have a strategic vision, and you want them to have a strategic vision for all of the United States of America, but probably also their worldview. How do they view the rest of the world? Do they view themselves as the leader of the free world? Or do they view themselves purely as, I'm going to do whatever is best for America? Now, I think all the presidents that I serve wanted to do what was best for America, but in the end, they knew that those four viewed it as a balance. And the last, I think, the big attribute that they bring to the table that you really need as a president, again, doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, is the ability to communicate and connect with our 300 million plus fellow American citizens. And again, depending on the worldview, the rest of the world.
That's great. And I think it really ties into a question that's been on my mind. When we're moving from the role of the individual to the institution, and then also thinking about how the institution, and one in particular that you served, Homeland Security, and how it evolved over multiple institutions, and a nascent one, and at that. So the question is really, how has Homeland Security priorities changed from time you saw from the early days until I guess even today now, and how you might reflect on some of the changes and differences?
The Department of Homeland Security, as we spoke about earlier in the podcast, has only been around now for effectively 22 years. So you got to go back to 9/11, and that drove a lot of people think, 9/11 happened, DHS was created along with TSA, and actually happened over a course of 2 years. So it wasn't until we got to 2002 when DHS actually gets signed. You have the Blue Ribbon Commission. You actually have TSA gets created almost instantaneously under the Department of Transportation. Because why? All you have to do is watch any 9/11 documentary or read any book, and it was because you could literally just walk onto a plane with box cutters, which is, what the Al-Qaeda terrorists effectively did for those 4 ill-fated airplanes. So TSA is created effectively towards the end of 2001, early 2002, and then DHS comes along. So if you walk your way backwards for Homeland Security, you certainly could go back to the Revolutionary War. We won't go back that far. I think for the purposes of this podcast and to those who tend to listen to it, I think you really want to go back to, and for me, we'll just go back to my timeline, to the Clinton administration. We speak about 9/11 as if everybody knows about 9/11. Even my students, I always ask whether they're freshmen or sophomores, by definition, they were all born after 9/11. But because I'm often asked to speak about the Department of Homeland Security, I put a picture up there, G.W. Bush, the World Trade Center, and Tom Ridge. They usually get G.W. Bush. They never get Governor Ridge, who was the first DHS secretary. He's actually the first Homeland Security advisor, then the first secretary. But they always get the World Trade Center. They always know about 9/11. And I think that's really interesting. And that's how they view Homeland Security, or at least for a long time they did. I think, and I'll get to that question about where we're at now on Homeland Security. But what's interesting, and the three of us certainly know this, just because I know basically how old you guys are. And just go back to 1995. And this is really, if you had said Homeland Security us pre 9/11, we would have said Oklahoma City bombing of the Bertha building, of the government building in Oklahoma City, where McVeigh and Nichols, who are effectively, today would be called alt-right, or certainly right-wing extremists, but definitely anti-government extremists. And they blow up a federal building, about $600 million in damages, but more importantly, 168 fellow Americans killed, simply because they were government civil servants. They weren't even political officials. I think there was some political appointees are certainly adjacent to that thing. But this was largely McVeigh and Nichols, who were both Army veterans, who met at Fort Benning, Georgia, in basic, and had come to the conclusion that the government was overstepping their rights on American individual rights. And they said, we don't like what happened in Waco, Texas, 2 years prior, in 1993, the Branch Davidian complex. Again, if I say any of this in a current, political science class, most folks would have to be Googling it and taking a look at it. But again, you would ask me, where has it evolved over time? Well, since the Clinton administration, that was it, domestic terrorism. And then 9/11 happens, and our view of Homeland Security turns entirely, probably mostly justified, to foreign terrorists, and in particular Islamic terrorists. And things don't really ramp down from there in terms of the threats. If you take a look at some of the biggest, and however you define terrorism, but if you look at what happened in Oslo, 77 people are killed. That's to a far right terrorist. Paris, Charlie Hebdo, 2015, 130. That's actually an Islamic terrorist. And then 2019 Christchurch in New Zealand, again, an alt-right terrorist, 51 people killed. Now, there's so many other different ways for terrorism to happen. But then you have, as I come into the Biden administration, I get sworn in bipartisan vote, by the way, sworn in June 2021. What happened 6 months prior to that was January 6th and the storming of the Capitol, which was defined as, doesn't matter what kind of history books you read, as largely an alt-right movement on the government in the election of effectively 2020. So that was the focus. Clinton domestic, Bush foreign terrorism, Obama largely a continuation of counterterrorism, Biden really looking at the far right. And if you think just about the things I said, New Zealand, Paris, Norway, these were all organizations that were effectively threatening the government in some ways. Today, I would say that Homeland Security has become fully politicized. And I'm not being, this could be true if a Democratic administration was, but I would say Homeland Security has become fully politicized. Immigrants and Antifa, which, by the way, whenever I ask people, what does Antifa stand for? They go, they're the far left. And I said, well, they're actually anti-fascist. I mean, that's literally what the acronym stands for. But those are the groups. And the two of you, the three of us, are old enough to remember a Speaker of the House named Tip O'Neill. He had a saying that all politics is local. All politics is local. And now I generally answer the question that they said, well, what's happened to Homeland Security? I said, well, all Homeland Security policy is politics now. And I would rather us get back to where Homeland Security is effectively just national security, and national security is Homeland Security. We had another saying, as you guys might remember, is that politics stops at the water's edge. The thought was we're all against the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and now we should really be viewing it in the same way. We should not have politics involved in how we really view Homeland Security. Because if you look at the mission of the Department of Homeland Security, the mission is, it's still on the Trump administration website, so they've carried it through, which I think is good, that with honor and integrity, we will safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values. I'll say it again for emphasis. With honor and integrity, we will safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values. And if you unpack that, it really talks about the first clause being, values and protection. And where does that come from? And I think it really comes from the Constitution. And then if you go back to, then what is the administration supposed to be doing it? Well, strategy is a combination of ways and means. The administration provides the ways and means to achieve the same ends. And it shouldn't matter what party you're coming from. You should be focused on the threats that have the most threats to the American people. And I think today, the laundry list, unfortunately, is super long. But I think those that have less partisan labels to them would be fentanyl, artificial intelligence. I'm not being a doomer, but artificial intelligence is going to have a huge impact, both for good and likely for bad, in terms of fueling threats against the United States of America, impact on our elections, our election system, and our critical infrastructure in particular. And then I'll just close with, on the critical infrastructure piece, that's really the cyber threats, both from criminals and cyber criminals and state actors like China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea, focused on our critical infrastructure, which I mentioned before, the 16 water, food, energy, communications, which are like our phones, transportation, our cars, healthcare, and then other ones like nuclear, chemical, money, data centers, things of that nature. So that's where I think we're at today. The biggest threat is probably to our critical infrastructure. And just take a look at Ukraine and to some extent Iran, of how important critical infrastructure is literally to the lives and livelihood of the citizens who are there.
I want to pick up on that point at the end about, the lives and livelihood of the citizens and this connection from the global to the doorstep of the average person, where Homeland Security really sits at that nexus. And to take your counter fentanyl efforts that you spearheaded in the previous administration as an example, because it does seem that in the past, we have always wanted to stovepipe an issue, whether it's education, whether it's critical infrastructure, food, uh, energy. We've always wanted to kind of dice it up and put it into a silo. Whereas in a previous podcast that I used to host called The Doorstep, we had Nahal Tusi from Politico talking about we live in a world now of omni-policy, that the barriers between what is foreign policy and domestic policy, homeland security, national security, international security are all dissolving, and that we have to get a handle that a problem may pass through several stages. Fentanyl does seem to be one of those issues that obviously it impacts an individual. It's a deadly drug. It corrodes communities, but then as you widen the aperture, its connection to organized crime, its connection to foreign actors who may see this as an instrument of sharp power, as a way to damage the target society. So in your work on the counter fentanyl issue, how did you see and how did you navigate really the intersection of the domestic drug treatment, law enforcement, local, state, federal considerations, the international wing of that, how you handled the drug trafficking, relationship with partners, relationships with competitor states? How did all of that come together into a strategy?
Yeah, it's again, if I go back to there's lots of different. Both of you are high-speed PhDs who understand international relations through and through, and also how strategy is made. I'll just pick the one definition that tends to come in pretty handy, which is strategy is a combination of ends, ways, and means. And the ends, like, so where do you want to get to? I think on counterfentanyl is reduce. What is the issue at play? And the issue at play was, depending on how you view it, not politically, just by facts, is about 85,000 Americans a year were dying of fentanyl, and many not by choice. It's like so many people look at fentanyl and they say, "Oh, it's like meth. It's like cocaine. It's like don't take meth, don't cocaine, you won't die." Right? Don't take fentanyl. But fentanyl is, one of the issues with fentanyl is that the cartels, the new generation Jalisco cartel or the Sinaloa cartel, they're all about making money. That's a $50 billion enterprise for those organizations. And so it's about getting you hooked, and it's about finding ways to use fentanyl, which is effectively a synthetic opioid, getting into stuff like Xanax, which is not an illegal drug, or antidepressants, or ADHD medicine, right? Any way that they could find their way. So number one is, don't buy in the black market, know where you're getting your prescription drugs from. And then there's other things, which is, don't go into those places that would have fentanyl, just like that was not a prescription drug or a fake prescription drug. 85,000 Americans, that's like 200 Americans. That's like a 707, falling out of the sky once per day over the course of an entire calendar year. And that was pretty significant. And I think to your point, Nick, this was, I like your terminology in terms of omni policy, it was pretty obvious that this is not just the bastion of DEA. From DOJ, and this isn't even about turf fighting. It had to be bigger than that, and DEA agreed with that, and so they've been partnering. I say that this wasn't just Biden administration; this was the Trump 1 administration, Obama 2 administration, where synthetic opioids, fentanyl in particular, were really coming into vogue. And the cartels had figured out, boys, is a good way to make money because you get people hooked, and just if you don't kill them, now they're unfortunately addicted, and it keeps moving through. But at some point, it gets to the point where you're looking for the bigger high, and then unfortunately leads to an overdose. So there had been a decent, I think, between DOJ and DHS, DEA, ATF to a lesser extent, and Homeland Security investigations for DHS being pretty good partners. But when I came in, I recognized, I was more of a counter-terrorism guy, not a counter-drug guy whatsoever. And as soon as I came in, I thought this is clearly a much bigger issue that we, the Biden administration, should really be taking on full force. You call it Omni, I call it interagency, and said we really need to bring all aspects of national power to bear. And again, we're a bunch of political science wonky guys. So I didn't say the dime over and over, but diplomatic, information / intelligence, economic, and military. We have to bring all those pieces together. And on the diplomatic side, it really effectively was Mexico, who were complicit by simply being complicit because they allowed Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel to exist, and the other cartels that were driving the drug trade. So they were somebody we really had to engage at. We did quite a bit. I'll tell a little story towards the end of this answer. And then China, because a lot of the precursor chemicals and the way these pills are literally put together, these blue powdered pills put together, were really coming from China. And this has been sort of an up and down with China. China initially, during both during Trump and also Biden administration, we're like, okay, got it. We don't like fentanyl either, and it kills our citizens as well. But unfortunately, it gets lost in what you would obviously consider to be the larger geopolitical issues, and particularly anything around Taiwan. So you have Mexico and China on the diplomatic. On the economic, it is $1 billion, $50 billion enterprise on both sides of the border in Mexico and the United States of America. And so lowering the demand, pretty important. DHS was not in charge of demand, but ONDCP was. So we worked a lot together, DHS and ONDCP. You have demand and supply. I was focused on supply. Our ONDCP counterparts are focused on the demand, lowering the demand side. And I think on the military, and then I'll get to the intelligence, military ends up being pretty key here because the U.S. military has great relationships and partnerships. You mentioned that, Nick, with some of the really big levers of power in Mexico, which are, no surprise here, the Mexican military, in particular the Navy and the Army. Less so the border forces and much so the Navy and the Army. Very trusted there, very powerful as well. On the intelligence side, I think this is the game-changing. I think you're seeing the Trump administration continue the good work of the Biden administration. No one's going to give either side credit, but I'm watching it as an academic to some extent. And it's really leveraging intelligence organizations that heretofore really weren't used as much, largely over on the DoD side, the NSA, DIA, NGA, so we had a lot of overhead optics, let's call it that. INR over at State, Treasury INA, because we wanted them involved for sanctions. So the entire capability of the DNI. We already had CIA, FBI, DEA, ATF, HSI, again, Homeland Security investigations and DHS, CBP and DHS INA involved. But bringing all of them together, operating in the silos, as you said, is not the way to do that, especially on the intel side. You both know that. So it's one of the things I really drove and said, this is a huge priority for the Biden-Harris administration and will be the ringleader, so to speak, and we brought them together. I'll just close with, we were able to bring all of that together. It was one of my last international trips, went down on a Coast Guard Gulfstream jet. It was me, the Homeland Security Advisor, Sherwood Randall, the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, and the head of ONDCP. And we met with President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador and got them really to, I think, move to a much higher level of commitment. President Trump has continued to do that. There's some of his approaches have sometimes approached international law barriers, attacks on Venezuelan boats, things of that nature. But eventually, that's what he's done. Is he's brought in economic through tariffs, certainly the military through attacking boats, using FTO, foreign terrorist organization designations, and put a war on cartels. So some continuity there, actually, from Biden to Trump.
It's really fascinating also because what struck me was thinking about the war on drugs from ages ago, as some of the people we interact with may not be aware of, and compare that to today and how the geopolitics have shifted in that direction. One thing kind of to compare the two also is thinking about this changing international order. And if we can plug an earlier podcast as well as relatively new colleague, Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, who we had on this podcast. He spoke a little bit about the new global operating system. And some people also know this is a new world order. I know that you listen to the podcast and that you're a longtime student and participant in this type of world order through a lot of your experience in government. What I was wondering from you is to kind of get a better understanding from your perspective, if we either assume that this is going away, it's under strain or dead, the international order as we see it, how should we think about this current state or the state in the future? What should we try to preserve it? Should we think about it, or what type of world should we try to prepare for?
Yeah, I mean, you asked three really big questions there, and I am big fan of Admiral Sandy Winnefeld. Love his podcasts. It's a super cool podcast that he has. You guys have a super cool podcast as well. But what's interesting is that Sandy, again, about relationships. Nick asked me about this earlier, which was I actually knew Sandy when he was the J5, and I was the senior director for Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is 2009 to 2011, and so I would be there as chairing interagency policy committee meetings, and there'd be Sandy, and then the Marine, the J3 was a Marine 3-star, and it was great. It was a great relationship. And then we fast forward. I was thinking about coming to Georgia Tech. He was one of the folks I reached out to. I said, what do you think? He says, oh, definitely do it. Now, to be fair, Sandy is a Georgia Tech graduate. So, he was definitely pushing for the, from the alumni side, but it was sort of no-brainer for me as well. Living here in Atlanta, and Georgia Tech and the Nunn School are great. I agree with him. Look, it's not that hard to disagree, to agree with Sandy just because he's Sandy, and not that hard to agree with the fact that we are in a new world order, a new global operating system. This is where I think it's interesting to study it at this time. I mean, if I bring my own example, now not everybody can do this. It just depends when you entered the study of international relations. But I entered graduate school in Oxford, so international school in the UK, in the fall of 1987. I'm not asking every listener to think, where was the world in 1987? But I can tell you where the world was in 1987. We were, the Cold War was still going on. The United States Army was telling me and my West Point graduates, we need to go to the East German, West German border, to the Czechoslovakian border, and we need to prepare to fight if the Cold War went hot. And effectively, we would hold the line while American air power got into phase 2, and then we would try to, sue for peace. But we were going to be the biggest armored speed bump in history if this is where it went. So I entered fall of 1987. Within 2 years, the Cold War was effectively over. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was being dismantled. But for 2 years, all I did was study the Cold War. And I studied Sovietology, and that's something that you can't even take anymore unless you're a history major. So to me, 2025 is sort of like 1989, right? It went through this major shift of having this international rules-based order, not always effective, not always fair, but certainly had led to probably the biggest growth, economic growth in the certainly in the 20th century. And now, we're living in a place where, what's driving international world order is really bilateral, very transactional, very isolationist. And on top of that, we have this revolutionary military affairs, drones or hypersonic missiles. We have AI and technology being changing factors. And I think it's bilateral versus multilateral. It's go it alone versus collective security. I am not an expert in, you guys are far more expert in international affairs than I am, but I think this is such an interesting time to be studying whether you are in a graduate school course, if you're an undergraduate, or if you're a field grade officer going through a military college, like the Naval War College. This is a really important time because you're getting to see it in a new way. And there's going to be, I mean, you're already starting to see it. I mean, I know you both write things. Maybe one of you will be, George Kennan, and you're going to write the new Mr. X article, and it won't be containment. Maybe it's a version of. It certainly doesn't appear to be globalization. And what do we like in post-globalization? I do think that, again, if we stand back, and people often ask me, what book should they be reading? They expect me to come in with some amazing, what's the current, hot book. I tell them to go back and look for, and Nick, you'll appreciate this as a historian, is I say, go back and look at books that have some historical relevance. It won't be one for one or apples to apples, but go back and look for a time in history where it was similar conditions in terms of the environment. And maybe it was a moral collision between democracy and transactionalism, or isolationism and globalization. And so I often say, go back and read, and also because it's a great, well-written book, Doris Kearns Goodwin's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, No Ordinary Time. Because if you read the first third of that book, I've read it 3 times in my life, and I just reread it about a year ago, especially relative to Putin and Ukraine, is the first third of that book effectively is 2025. It's isolationism as rules, domestic over foreign policy, American interest over global security, and U.S. manufacturing over the global supply chain. And I think, history can teach us a lot if you take it within context.
As you were making that commentary, I was, again, thinking back to bringing it back to the individual, looking at the span of your career, looking at all of the different fields in which you've worked in. You've worked in terms of your career throughout what we might call this age that kind of ended, where the Cold War ended and we entered this post-Cold War era. And now, as you suggest, we may be coming out of it into a new era. But are there certain things from your experiences that when you're with students, you either say, here are some experiences or some lodestones that I think still are relevant, or are there things where you're saying, this is what we thought over the last 30 years. Here are the new sets of questions you're going to have to grapple with. I know that's a bit broad and vague, but a sense of, if we are at this age where we're at this inflection point, which in fact was the term used in the Biden national security statement, that specifically saying we're in an inflection point right now in terms of where the world is. Either what of your own experiences do you say to students, learn from this, or what are you saying in terms of, these are the questions you need to be asking? If the old goalposts and milestones are now becoming less relevant, then how do we get to new ones?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Nick, because it comes down to, and it depends on, if we try to take the politics out of it, which I think is actually dangerous to try to take the politics out of it, because it's sort of a fairy godmother sort of view of the world. You go, well, let's take politics out of it. Well, you can't, because it's the current reality, and it really is domestic over international right now. If you take a look at the debate on not the far right, but just not even MAGA, but I would just say the right wing and those who voted for President Trump. I mean, there's a heavy debate on internationalism. Why are we at war in Iran? Why do we send anything to Ukraine? Who cares about Russia? And I think when you pair it, what I often say to my students is, step back and think to yourself, what's best for America? And at this point, not just use the rhetoric, what's best for America, but to really ask what's best for America. And this is how we, to some extent, right, in the Clinton administration, we ended up with globalization, with free trade, with the World Trade Organization, of us really bringing the World Trade Organization and the rest of the world, China in particular, into the 21st century of an optimized global trade system. Now, it makes sense on paper. Certainly, there is, it's often gets blamed for the demise of U.S. manufacturing. But there's all sorts of other factors that go into there. But if you ask what is best for the United States of America, it's not always going to be, as I often say, a pure like, well, this is best. This is absolutely what's best. We want to reduce the trade imbalance, and tariffs are at best, because it is net. This is just reality. In any negotiation, whether you're buying a car, you're negotiating for something online, you're on eBay, it's always going to be a net. There's going to be you want to be, in the end of the day, more winning than losing, but net, is it a win for America and for the American people? And I think that's the question that folks are going to have to ask themselves. And if they get down to the most nitty gritty, I will often ask students to hold up their phones. And of course, they get scared because like the phone is like, just like for me, is my most personal thing. As I said, I'm not going to ask how many, just think through your head, how many of you have Amazon.com on your phones? Almost all of them do, right? The Amazon app. And I say, don't tell me, but how many of you have ever used, one click to buy? And how many of you who are Prime users expect that thing to show up tomorrow? And I don't ask for them to raise hands because I don't want to be invasion of their privacy. But, you can just see in their eyes, and we just know 95% of them are going, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine waiting 2 days for anything. And I said, that is, if that's a part of the way you define American life for you, and what's necessary for you, not sufficient probably, but what's necessary for you to survive, then that's to some extent globalization. That's about shortening the supply chains and a bunch of other things about Amazon having things, and you could talk about labor markets and things of that nature as well. But I think that is where we're going to have to come to as an American people, as we view ourselves as being part of this new world order. And I think, our memories were pretty long for a long time coming out of World War II. It was pretty bad. And Hiroshima, and America is still the only country ever to use a nuclear weapon to unfortunately devastating and impactful effect. I think we have forgotten what that is like. And that's why we ended up in this rules-based international order with a NATO, with a UN. Why the other book I should be recommending people read is any book on the Marshall Plan, because many people think, well, that's just because we are great. We're great at, we're the shining city on the hill. We're the shining city on the hill, but we also kind of knew that Germany and Japan was going to come back at some point, just the way they did after World War I for Germany. And that really, we wanted them on side when they eventually did, those peoples eventually did evolve into that. I'll just give us a plug here. I think there's, I said, so, in terms of books, I would say No Ordinary Time, things of that nature. I'm also plugging 2 books lately. I don't make any money off of them. As Larry knows, I did a fireside chat with General Stan McChrystal. He wrote a book on character. You can check it out on YouTube. The Nunn Schools dutifully put that up there. And then there's a new book that I just started reading called On Courage. It's by Julia Angwin and Ami Fields Mayer. The subtitle is, very provocative, which is How to Be a Dissident in an Age of Fear. Now, this is not a how-to book about how to be a dissident, overthrow your current government, whether it's, the United States, Venezuela, or Hungary. But it's really about a why me and why now book. But I think it's an interesting book because autocracy is becoming more the dominant governing framework in the world than democracy. And if you at least presume that that most people want to live in the democracy, then you really have to understand how autocracies work and how people live and survive intellectually and sometimes through action. Because I read a statistic recently that 75% of the people in the world live in some form of autocracy, which is the highest since the 1970s. Who wants to go back to the 1970s? So read On Character, On Courage, and there's all sorts of other great things out there too. But I'll close with that.
John, I don't think you could have scripted a better closing for any of this. And we really want to thank you for your time. I know I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure Nick did, but he will answer for himself.
Oh, it's a wonderful conversation, and we could have kept going on for another hour, but we need to draw to a close, unfortunately. But we'd love to have you back on again for a future podcast episode.
Oh, great. Well, that's the greatest compliment you get. Now you actually have to invite me back now. Otherwise I'm gonna be like, did they really like me? But the clicks will decide at the end of the day. So take care. Again, thanks very much for having me on. It was a real privilege and definitely an honor.
This has been an episode of Shifting Ground, a podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs. For more information about the articles mentioned in this episode, please visit us at orbisjournal.org. Until next time.